everyone. My name is Intis. This is the second video explaining how WordWars works. And we're going to start by taking a look at the handlebars page, which holds the HTML. We're only going to look at it very briefly because most of the page is not that exciting if you're familiar at all with Bootstrap. But what we do have is there's two things in here which I think are kind of interesting. One is that we have this series of audio elements. And what an audio element is when the page loads, it's going to look at this source and make a single copy of that file. So, for example, I have a whole bunch of audio elements. They all have IDs, so I can reference them elsewhere in the code. And they all have different sources, except for explosion. Explosion is copied 3 times, and it's all the same file. The reason being is that, in my experience, when you play an audio file, that file is either playing or paused. So if I want to play 2 explosions at the same time, I can't make the same audio file play twice. It'll only set that one audio file to play again, so it's not doing anything. So if I want to have 2 or 3 explosions sounds occurring at the same time, I need to have separate audio elements. And even though they're referencing the same audio file, it allows me to have multiple sounds of the same kind in the same time frame. Also, this page has something called has the starry background, which is actually prefabricated code that we found online. It does a bunch of magic that I don't quite understand. Maybe one day I'll figure it out and make a new video about it. But basically, the entire screen is wrapped in a container fluid with the ID of GameSpace, and GameSpace has a lot of stuff going on in it. So we're going to take a real brief look at the game.css file. It's reasonably long, but the interesting part is here. I decided to make a class called WordTargetAnimate, and basically I made a whole mess of classes that all have a number at the end, and that number corresponds to how many seconds it takes for that object, for that element, to move from one side of the screen to the other. So basically, one class holds the time and the direction of the movement. The other class that I have down here is word x1 through 5. And what this does is it controls the rate at which the words move. So some of them will have a steady rate of movement the entire time it's moving across the screen. Some of them start slow and end slow. Some of them just start slow, and so forth. These are just the different ways in which a animated element can move. Basically, what's important here is that I have a whole mess of classes that I can give things to make them move at different speeds. Let's see if anything else is particularly interesting in here. Let's see. I suppose the globe on the side of the screen is okay. Oh, it's not in this version. Okay, so in a later version, I managed to animate the globe so that it rotates while you play. But it's not available online yet. We haven't posted it. All right. So yeah, the WordTargetAnimate and the speed, the word x1, x2, etc. classes are what control the animation. All right. Let's get in the script. So this is the Firebase stuff as used by my teammate Lou. It allows the game to have multiplayer capabilities. We're not done implementing them yet, but it needs to be called at the beginning of the scripts page so that anything that references Firebase later on will know what the variables are. All right. So the game has a whole slew of global variables. This object here contains basically all the information the game needs to run. A bunch of these start at null, and they can become one value or another, or have a numeric value. For example, if I wanted to change the time that you could play each round, I would have to change seconds per wave and time left. Or if I want the game to end, I have to change end wave trigger. Difficulty is how often words spawn, and so forth and so on throughout these. Let's see. here is a bunch of code that perhaps Lou will make a video of in the future that explains how the multiplayer capabilities are functioning. Basically, it checks to see if your page is in a game room, which means that it's not just WordWars app dot Heroku app.com/game. It's that plus another room ID. So if your game has a room ID, then it knows that you're playing multiplayer, and to reference that room ID on Firebase. There's a bunch of code here which does that interaction. I'm not as familiar with that, so I'm not going to speak on it. Here is something called game totals. And what game totals is the summation of a single series of games that you've played. So the other object that we looked at, game state, holds the information for this particular run of the game. Game totals holds all the information that you've accrued over multiple games until the point where you lose. So at the point that you lose, this information is how you did. It's how many words you missed, how far you got, how many enemies there were, and so forth. This information is going to get pushed up to MySQL, which is a database, which stores this information so you can look at the high score screen later. My code is not the most elegant. For example, this variable was never used, but I thought it was useful at the time. And let's see, what's next? Okay, so here we have a little piece of code which is not too crazy. Basically what it is I made an object, a string array which holds the extensions for 3 different images for the little aliens. Because if you notice, all the aliens were different. So what happens is there are 3 of them. There's something called invader tick. And what invader tick does is it ticks from 0 to 1 to 2, which corresponds with array element 1, 0, 1, and 2 here. And basically, whenever I make an invader, it references invader bracket invader tick. So that means that the first invader is going to be this, then that, and so forth. So it's constantly making different aliens for variety's sake. We have a word bank, and it stores all the words. We have an active bank, which stores all the words that happen to be on the screen at the time. Used words is the words that we've used so far in the game. So that prevents them from being used again. Endgame rows is the array needed to hold the information so that I could make all the you lose ships go across the screen. Because if you notice, it made 9 ships in every row. Basically, these are just 9 independent tickers that keep track of how many ships are made in each row. Stop making ships also relates to that. It keeps track of how many ships have been made. And bonus word, I don't remember how that's used currently. Let me find out. Find bonus words. Apparently, bonus words actually never got used. So this could probably be removed. All right, cool. All right, so the game begins by making an API call to WordNick. So the API call to WordNick is basically going to be this long URL that asks for random words, words that have dictionary definitions, which means that they're real words, and a bunch of other conditions which bring back just normal English words, even if they are a little obscure. Now we're going to make an AJAX call to that API asking for information. We're going to pass in this URL, and when we succeed, it's going to give us a result. This result comes back as an array of objects, which are both, I believe it's both IDs and words. So we're going to go through all those words. So we're going to set a for loop to run through the result.length. We're going to go through every, let's see, push word temp, results, word y, result, word y. Okay, so if I remember correctly, the object that gets returned is an array of arrays of words. I think. Word y. Okay, so yeah. So what's going to happen is one loop looks through each grouping of words in the bigger array. The next one looks through each grouping, smaller word grouping that comes following it. And, I see. Okay, now I got it. All right, so this function, I was a little bit off kilter. It's going to look at every word. It's then going to look through every character in every word to make sure that all the characters in every word are a letter. In fact, even a lowercase letter. Because what's happening here is, so in the first word, I'm going to look at the word, and I'm going to look at character YYY. And as long as that character is a real letter, and we're pushing and push word is still true, it's going to push that word into the word bank, which is the words that we're going to use for the game. So basically, this is all just a checker to make sure that all the letters in every word that we're using are actual letters and not characters or capitals or dashes or asterisks or periods or anything. Because initially when we made that, we would have like compound words and stuff like that would have like dashes or an asterisk in it. This basically just clears it up to make sure that our word list is nice and clean. After that, we make a words object. This is all the multiplayer code that I'm not as familiar with because my teammate Lou did most of it. And then we're going to call up 3 functions that are going to get the game going. So we're going to show instructions, which opens the modal and displays some information in it. So this is just using some jQuery. So I'm making a string of text that contains all this in it, which are the instructions for the game. It's an unordered list. And then I'm going to make the HTML of message to player be this chunk of text. So that's what show instructions does. Open modal displays the modal that has the instructions shown in it. And then it's going to be, they're going to activate the start button state. Start button state. Start button state. Okay. Start button state is a function that I made that allowed me to control the little red button in the corner of the screen. Because as you see, when you click it, it goes to a gray state, and it also has another state of waiting. So what this does is that you pass a parameter to it, and that parameter can be on, off, wait, or next. And each one of them makes the temp button variable a different thing. So in this case, it is the red button that's clickable. And in this case, it is, let's see, on off, it is a primary button with a background gray color and an X in it. So basically, I'm just activating and deactivating the button that's there. Also, I've made it so that the game is going to look for anything with the .start class, which is the button I just made. Because what I found was that if I didn't have the game look again at all the elements that have the .start class, the button wouldn't press. Because in the beginning of a program, very often you have a bunch of jQuery buttons and triggers and stuff. So basically, what the program does normally in the beginning is you run this, and it looks for everything that has the start class. And whenever you click on it, it does something. In this instance, because I'm writing the element after the game has been started, after the page has been loaded, I then have to find it again. I have to find all the things that have the start class in it, make it a variable, and then whenever that variable is clicked, if we're not playing multiplayer, then we do this, and if we are playing multiplayer, then we do that. What this does, which is the meat of the game, is start wave function, which begins the game, and the ID query function, which what it does is, so when you click here, all of a sudden my cursor is in here and I can type. So that's what the query focus function does. So let's jump to start wave. All right. So when the wave starts, it calls that previous function and sets the button to off, which is the gray X. It's going to check to make sure that the game has not been won. And the reason for this is that once you complete a wave, it sets GameState.Victory to true. So the game starts differently when you're going from wave to wave as opposed to starting a new game. So in this one, you do something called a full reset. What a full reset does is it clears almost all of the game's variables so that you have a clean slate going into it. The other option is something called game reset, which means you're going, if GameState.Victory is equal to true, that means that you're going to have a game reset, which is just changing the game state variables, not the game totals variables. Because the game totals variables hold your information between rounds, game state just holds your information for each round. So when you do the start wave, you reset the game. It sets GameState.Go to true, which is one of the variables that gets checked, and then it starts the game with game start. Let's go to game start. All right, function game start. This begins the 3-second countdown. This is a line of code meant to just make sure that the end game you lose function doesn't make an error. It might be unnecessary at this point, but I'm not going to bother changing it. Clear all rows literally does that. We increment the wave that the game is on, so it goes from wave 0 to wave 1 and so forth. Game header update is a function that's used to update all of the information up here, and that occurs whenever something changes one of those stats. We go to game header update. It is exactly that, plus one more thing. So aside from changing all the numbers on the top part of the screen, also the little city icon on the bottom of the screen, as you miss words, parts of it get chopped up, and you're only going to see smaller and smaller portions of it. This is a switch statement that gets past the GameState.MissWords, the number of words that you've missed in a particular round. And depending on how many words you missed, it's going to display a different city image in that slot. So what you're doing is just using jQuery. That element has this class city icon. It has an attribute of an image attribute, and you just change the image source to be the appropriate image for the amount of words that you've missed. So that's what game header update does. All right, so game start calls game header update, which resets all your stuff. Okay, so the countdown timer works like this. It starts at X, which is 4, and it creates a set interval function, which means that it's going to just keep executing this chunk of code every 1 second. So what's happening in here? If X is equal to 0, it does something. If X is less than 0, it does something else. And if it's any other number, it does this. So what you're going to see is it plays the audio, the ding audio, and it also is going to display an animated character. So what you see is that in row 4 of the 9 columns, the HTML is going to be an H1 center aligning, which means that the word is going to be in the middle of the screen. Word target animate 50 makes the word go from here to there in half a second. Word X2 is the style at which it moves across the screen, and it has white text. The character itself is X. So what is X? X is up here. So initially, you decrement it. So by the time X is checked, X is already 3. When X is 3, it's going to make a thing, stick X in it, and half a second later, it is already in the center of the screen. Also, this sets a timeout. So what a timeout does is after 0.6 seconds, it's going to execute this code. So we made a thing. Half a second later, it's in the middle. A tenth of a second after that, the timeout goes off. What the timeout does is it rewrites this piece of code with something almost identical. I said that this class is word target animate 5.1. What that does is instead of making the text go from here to the middle of the row, it makes it go from the middle of the row to the end. So you're not seeing smooth animation. You're seeing one object getting animated from the right to the middle, and then 0.6 seconds later, another element being animated from the middle to the end. And this is how the game start function works, or the beginning of the game start function works. When it reaches 0, it's going to do the same thing, but for the word go. And once it increments one more time, it's going to empty row 4. It's going to reset the game. It's going to start the game loop, which is where all the action happens. And it's going to set the time start, which keeps track of how much time you've played. And it's going to do something called clear interval. So set timeout and set interval both have respective counter functions, which remove themselves. Because set interval just keeps doing its thing over and over and over again. To get rid of it, you need to clear interval. And in my personal experience, I've had problems, for whatever reason, trying to clear interval of a variable outside of itself. But if you clear the interval within itself, the reference is there and it doesn't come back undefined. Anyway, we're starting the game loop, so let's jump to that. All right, game loop is a function. It takes a parameter. That parameter is the amount of time that you want to see words appear. So what does game loop do? Game loop so the first thing it does is sets a timeout, and at the end of that timeout, it sets end wave trigger to true. End wave trigger causes other things to cascade and stop functioning, which is good because it makes the wave end. It's set to the amount of the seconds per wave amount. It also sets a game clock. The game clock just keeps track of how much time has passed for the user. I could probably integrate both of these functions into the same one, but in this instance, I made one that functioned and then didn't bother to integrate the second one. Basically, this just has a clock that keeps writing in the wave time div. Lastly, it plays the aliens, the little saucer sound, and runs a set interval function that occurs every difficulty amount of seconds. So initially the difficulty is 2000, which means that every 2 seconds, the game is going to run this function. That function is if the game is over, which means if end wave trigger is equal to true, you do a status check to make sure the game is actually over, and then you end this function. Otherwise, you select a word. So let's keep moving. Select word, what does that do? It gets a random number between 0 and the length of the word bank, which is usually about 900. And it performs a new word lifecycle, which is the following function, using that word and passing null as a second parameter. Wordbank.splice then removes the word that's at the same index that is at that spot in the word array. So we find a word, we find a number, we get the word that's there, and then we remove that word from the list so we can't get it again. New word lifecycle takes 2 parameters. It takes the word itself and an amount of time if you want to pass an amount of time to it. You can actually pass more things in the time slot based on the code that I've written, but it's a little inelegant. Generally, you're going to be passing time in here. So it makes a variable, temp bonus word, which controls whether the word is a bonus word type. Basically, it displays a different kind of word. So if the time variable, if it is being passed the bonus word string, then it sets temp bonus word to true. Basically, this is just a check to see whether you want this word to be a bonus word type. If time is being passed null, you set time to the length of the word that you're passing, and you'll see why this is important in a second. We make 2 more variables, active row and possible rows. Active row is the row that we intend to write the div in. Possible rows is all the rows that currently have no words being written in them. So to figure that out is if the game is going, then we're going to do a 9-point ticker. And at all these numbers, if active bank, where's active bank? Okay. So active bank. Okay, so where's active bank? All right, back up here. When we made the word bank in the active bank, it starts at null. It starts at nothing. There's nothing in this array. Let's find where we were. That's not what I want. Game loop. All right. So in the active bank, in that slot, if that slot is null, which means it has no information, then the possible rows array gets pushed the number of that slot. So when the active bank is completely clean, all 0 through 9 slots are empty. So possible rows.push is going to have 0 through 9 inserted into its array. If the game is not going, then it does the exact same thing for end game rows, which is a slightly different function. All right, so after these have gotten called, we've now looked at all the rows and figured out which rows don't have any words in them. Now we set active row, which is the variable we had made before, equal to possible rows, and we randomly pick one of the possible rows that it could be. Now we set the active bank. Let's see. Active bank are the words that we want to know are on display. We're going to set it in the array slot that corresponds to the row that we randomly selected, and set it to the word that we are passing into this argument. From here on in, we're going to be assembling the div that's going to cross the screen. Random 1, 2, 3 just picks a random number between 1 and 5. We get a random speed, which is one of these CSS classes. That random number is 1 through 5. It's just going to set random speed to be one of these classes. And now we have the thing that actually makes the div. So if input contents, if the word that you're passing, if the string that you're passing is exactly this, then it does something. If you're going to pass a bonus word in, then it does something else. Lastly, this is the default. So first off, you increment the number of enemies that have been created so that we know how many enemies there have been. Then we're going to write in the row with the ID row followed by a number. In its HTML, we're going to create a div with class center, so the text within it is in the center. It's going to have the word target details, which allows the word gun to find it. It's going to have word target animate and the length of the word. So it's going to be word target animate like 5 if it's a 5-second word, or 6 if it's a 6-second word. And this is the way that we set the speed of the div. It's then going to get a random speed that we assigned before, and white, so the text is white. Within there, we're going to have a center class, a div that holds the image. The image is going to be of this class. It's going to have a width and a set height. It's going to use whichever invader we happen to be using at that time, using that random invader tick function. Also, we're going to pass a paragraph, which is going to be word target, which is being referenced by word gun. And within there, we're going to put the word that actually got passed to this function. So that's a mouthful. But basically, we're just assembling a div that has all the traits we want, all in one go. Word wrap. There we go. All right, lastly, we swap invaders. And this function just ticks up whichever invader GIF is being used at the time. And lastly, we set an explosion trigger. The explosion trigger is the timeout, which causes that div to be replaced with an explosion. I'll talk about that in 1 second. I just want to go through the other two possible outcomes. All right, so if you lose gets written, it basically does the same thing, except that it sets it makes a temp random number. So the speed of the word traveling does not correspond any longer to the length of the word. Instead, it just has a random speed that's between 2 and 10 seconds to arrive at its destination. It works in basically the exact same way as this, except that it has a random time to get there. Lastly, if you want to pass a bonus word, which is used in multiplayer, what it's going to do is basically do the exact same thing of making this thing with word target details and animate. It's always animate 10 in this instance, so the word is always going to take 10 seconds to cross. The image is slightly different, so it has a width of 70, and it has a different image source, so it's going to be saucer.gif. We didn't see any of that in the demonstration because you actually require a second player to initiate it. Lastly, it's going to play the audio for the bonus word. And it's going to have an explosion trigger, which is prefabbed rather than variable, because here we have a 10-second delay on it, and down here it is variable depending on the time that is passed into this function. All right, so explosion trigger. Explosion trigger is a set timeout function, which is going to look at the row. Okay, so let's start from the top. You pass in an amount of time, the corresponding row that you want it to affect, and the word that you want to delete, basically. The word that corresponds to that row. At the end of the length of the word plus 2 seconds, you are going to check to look in the active bank, which is the words that are on the screen right now. If they are the same as the word that you passed into this function, then we're going to remove that word from the active bank. We're going to make you miss a word. We're going to update the header to show that you missed a word. We're going to go into the row, the corresponding row, and we're going to display the explosion GIF. We're going to play the audio boom. Then we're going to check to see if you've lost the game. If this is true, we're going to set a bunch of variables and play the losing music. We're going to pause the go music, and we're going to do a game status check to see if you've it has to do with the losing function. I don't remember exactly what off the top of my head. Also, if you haven't lost, then it's going to set another timeout, a half-second timeout, which clears the row that you just displayed the explosion in. So what this function does is it checks to see if the word still exists on the screen, or rather in the array, and thusly also on the screen. If it does, delete the row, make an explosion, play some audio, check if you've lost, and set a timeout to get rid of the explosion. So that's what the explosion trigger does. Let's see. All right, so game status check. What it does is it checks all the variables in the game to see whether the game should go to the losing screen or the winning screen. So if all this stuff is true, then you've won. It's going to set an end to the time. It's going to set victory to true, and it's going to set status check to false, and it's going to end the wave. Alternatively, if you missed a bunch of words, then it does the opposite and sets you to game over. All right, so let's go to game over. Let's go to end wave first. All right, what does function end wave do? This shows you the victory screen, and it's doing kind of the same stuff that the other functions are doing. It sets the end wave trigger to true, so the other functions that are looking for end wave trigger to be true so that they can stop doing their intervals will now stop themselves because end wave trigger is true. Game state.difficulty is now going to increase. So the game gets harder whenever you win a round. You're going to multiply it by 0.9, making it slightly 10% harder. It logs the time using this function. It does some music pausing. It clears all the rows. It clears the active bank. And this function is going to see whether you've won or lost and do some things accordingly. If you won the game, then it's going to set end-wave ticker to 0. It's going to set ready counter to 0. We are going to, in row 4, create a table with the ID of victory table. We are going to write completed in the modal, and we're going to do a for loop for 8 times, and each time it's going to declare a variable, and then it's going to create an element and stick it in the victory table. That element is going to have the fast animation, and it's also going to have completed end-wave ticker. Let's see, how does that work? Completed. Okay, so completed is this string. End-wave ticker is a number going from 0 to 8. I could probably actually just use, I could have just used J as the variable here. I didn't need to use end-wave ticker. Anyway, basically it makes the V in a single element, and then it makes the I, and then it makes the C, and so forth. And because they're being made at different times, it keeps appending to the box in the middle, and it keeps making them come from off screen. And it does this every, oh, now I know why I couldn't do it. Because J is being used to set the timeouts for all of these functions. Because what this function does is that in an instant, it creates 8 different timeouts with 8 different time calls. So the first one happens 0.2 seconds later, the next one happens 0.4, and so forth, until 8 of them have passed. Each one is creating the element that holds each letter of victory. All right, so if you lost the game, then it's going to display defeated in the modal, and I believe this is a antique code. We don't actually need that anymore. Lastly, it sets a timeout that what it's going to do is write over all the stuff in the modal and then display the modal. And it does that 3.5 seconds after this function is called. So in the first 1.6 seconds, this code is going to create the victory sign, and then 3.5 seconds later, it's going to overwrite it and open the modal. All right, so game over. Game over function. All right, so it's going to pass the game totals object to the API, to the database. It's also going to set the wave number, and let's see what else it does. Checks the time, it stops making ships. Stop making ships was called and set to 82 in the beginning, and now it's being set to 0. So it sets the start button to try again, because the set start button is being adjusted. This probably doesn't need to be there, now that I think about it, because there's another function made that changes the button states. Let's see. Okay, so this function is the thing that makes all the different ships that say you lose. So what it does is I set an interval that occurs 50 times a second. And what this thing does is it increments the stop making ships variable every time you execute it. And if stop making ships, if all the ships have been made, then you're going to show the stats of the game, which updates what's in the modal, and then you're going to open the modal. Until then, it also is going to clear this interval. So once this number is 82, it goes to the next phase of the game. But until then, so while it's between 0 and 81, it's going to perform the new word lifecycle function with the you lose parameter. So it just keeps writing you lose and making it a random time because we have code in the new word lifecycle that looks at what the input contents is and changes things. So like here, if input contents is equal to you lose, it's then going to create a different div object than it would if it was something else. All right. Once you've run the game over function, it's going to set the start button state to on, which means that you can begin the game again. Because as we went over in the beginning, the start button is the way that the game allows you to start it. And at the very end of all the functions, the start button gets turned back on, and that is the gateway for the lever that you have to press to make everything happen. I'm going to look really briefly through all this stuff to make sure I didn't miss anything in particular. Ajax. Okay, we have to talk about the word gun. All right, so when the document first gets loaded up, it's going to set up the word gun. And what the word gun is that regex function I was talking about before. The word gun is going to look on the screen and find all the things that have the word target class. It's then going to look at your search field, the one that you're typing in, and set that as a variable as well. It's going to create this regex expression, which I still don't fully understand, but I'm assured is fully functional. You're going to create this regexp function and set it to a variable using this value being inserted there. And then for each target, which is the everything that has this class, you are going to look at this .text and set that to target word. You're going to set text to the text of the I actually don't know what that does. Place. All right. Well, I'll talk through it as much as I can. Basically, you have to talk to Matt, another group member of mine, for more clarity here. But the gist is that it's going to look through the word. It's going to cut it into pieces. It's going to replace part of the word with the stuff that you wrote and give it the emphasized tags, which make it red in this instance because we have CSS for that. Then it's going to put the remainder of the word after it, and then it's going to stick this chunk of HTML into that div box. Also, this function calls a game header update. So as you get more points, it'll tick up. Also, it increments the number of words you got and checks to see whether you originally it would check to see if you won the game, because originally the game would end once you've successfully typed a certain number of words, but now it's by timer. Also, the important thing is that the active bank, which is the words that are on the screen, it will find if the word that you typed is in the bank and set it to null. So remember that, so in the other function, when we were checking the active bank to see what words were on the screen so we could make the explosion happen, this sets it to null and also pushes the word to the used bank. So right now, this is like where the action's happening, to keep track of what words you're typing, where they are, and what they're going to be doing. All right, let us see what else is here. Explosion trigger, game status check, game start, we went over that. Game over, start wave, end wave. Start wave? Yeah, we did that. Full reset, reader swap, clear all rows, does exactly that. It goes through 9 rows and just makes them empty. All right, cool. So show stats. Show stats is going to display in the endgame div how you did. So we have a switch statement here. And if GameStart.victory is equal to true, which means to say that if you've won the game or lost the game, and default, there are 3 different possible outcomes. If you've won the game, we're going to show you how you did just that round, because we're only going to reference game state, which is a single round's stats. If you are defeated, then instead we're going to show you how you did over the course of the entire game, which is game totals. It's going to set the same four variables, or the same temp stats array to be these things. It's also going to set a variable called win, lose, banana, don't mind me, to hold whether you are victorious or defeated. All right, message. So it's going to clear the modal box. It's going to set the wave in the modal box. It's going to set the number in the modal box of the wave. Then we're going to tell the player, we're going to append to the message in the message box whether they've won or lost, and then what their stats were. Now here you can see in the points that the stats are padded a little bit. So it's going to pass the number of letters you got right times 200 times the number of city pieces that remain. And that's how you get the point score. So that's more, so show stats works like that for winning and losing. Let's see, push stats takes your last round stats and puts it in the full game stats, not the game stats, like the game totals object. Lastly, we just have a couple of helper functions. This just opens the modal, closes the modal, updates the header, checks what time it is, start button state. All right, and down here is the audio. I may, at one point, the way that I wanted to do it was have the audio play differently. This is actually unnecessary the way that I wrote it out here. I just needed to use like audio aliens.pause and audio aliens.play. I didn't need to make a function like this and pass a parameter which causes one or the other to happen. I could have just written this out. So bad on me, works anyway. This sets the volume for all the audios. And let's see. This is just a key up that checks to see if you push the enter key. If you push enter anywhere on the document, it sets your cursor to the word gun query field. And it also clicks the start button if it's possible to click the start button. So the game can be played with just a keyboard. You don't need a mouse. Because as soon as you go to the screen, you can click enter and then start playing. And I believe this is all Firebase stuff, which I'm unfamiliar with, and you'd need an explanation from Lou to solve. And that was a very long explanation of how this script file was, and I don't know how I wrote this, but I hope that makes some sense. And yeah, if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. Thank you.